we are hearing media reports that President Zelensky of Ukraine will be coming to Washington tomorrow to address a joint session of the United States Congress. I hope that is an accurate report. I think it's important that he come. This would be, by the way, the first time that he has left Ukraine in 300 days, not since the start of the invasion, which is now 300 days from today. Against all odds, Ukraine has held out against the Russian assault. Many thought that they would only be able to hold out for a week or so. Instead, it's been 300 days. They've pushed Russia back in so many places. I'm glad he's coming because I know what he will do is talk about his deep appreciation for what the American people have provided. Every time I've been with him, and I've traveled to Ukraine about 10 times since 2014, he talks about that, but particularly over the last few months, I've been to Ukraine twice, and he focused on the fact that they couldn't do it without us and the deep appreciation that he feels. Second, I know he will give us a firsthand report of what's going on. Just this morning, he was in Bakhmut, which is in eastern Ukraine. This is what it looks like in Bakhmut today. So he's going from a ravaged battle zone. It looks a little bit like a World War I battle zone when you see all the damage that has been occurring in this area. He'll be able to tell us specifically what is happening on the battlefield and talk about the continued Russian atrocities that are being committed in the country of Ukraine. I'm here for the 29th consecutive week on the floor of the Senate to talk about this attack on Ukraine, a brutal, illegal, and totally unprovoked war on a democratic ally of ours who just wants to live in peace with its neighbors, including Russia. In each of these previous 28 speeches, I've talked about the progress that's been made and some of the issues that the Ukrainian people still need to address, particularly with regard to more technology and more weapon systems from the West and from the United States. Today, I thought it might be useful to step back and take a look at how we got here and how far Ukraine has come over these 300 days. Let's consider what the Ukrainian military has accomplished since that initial Russian invasion of sovereign Ukrainian territory, now over 8 years ago. This first picture shows Ukrainian soldiers taking up positions in Kramatorsk back in 2014. This was, again, right after the so-called Revolution of Dignity, when Ukraine decided to turn to the West, the United States and Europe, democracy, free markets. And the Russian-backed corrupt government was thrown out. Russia responded by attacking Ukraine, taking Crimea and parts of the Donbass. These are the Ukrainian soldiers at that time. You can look at this very basic kit: old rusted weapons, boots that don't look very sturdy, helmets look like they're from the Soviet era, and they probably are. Small anti-armor weapons that really did not have the ability to stop the Russian armor. They couldn't puncture the armor in these Russian tanks and other armored vehicles. These were the soldiers who were tasked with stopping Russia's initial invasion in 2014. Again, they look more like soldiers from the 1980s. In those days, the Ukrainian military was underfunded, faced a lot of allegations of fraud, had a lot of corruption, was shockingly small. And that was on purpose because the Russian-backed government didn't want an effective military. So in 2014, with the help of an assortment of militias, they were able to slow Russia's advance just because the Ukrainians were taking the high moral ground, but they were unable to push the Russian forces out of the country or to keep them from taking Crimea and large parts of the Donbass, which remained in Russian hands. Let's fast forward now to 2022 today and see what our help has resulted in. This is a photograph of what soldiers look like on the front lines today. This is in a trench in Bakhmut, where you can see modern firearms and helmets, body armor, additional gear and equipment on their uniforms for extended operations in the field, and weapons that can actually make a difference. For instance, the American-made Javelin anti-armor missiles that were provided to them, which were so effective against the Russian tanks and other armored vehicles. There's an additional thing you can't see in this photograph or any photograph, but it's really important, and that's training. These soldiers in 2022 are far better trained than their predecessors, and they're schooled in Western tactics. They are competent, disciplined, and able to operate independently in uncertain circumstances. This stands in sharp contrast to how Russia's military has conducted itself in this conflict overly centralized command and control, poor discipline, and an unwillingness or an inability to learn from their mistakes. This is the modern military that has shattered the sword of Russia's war machine, and it was all made possible through the combined efforts of the United States, American taxpayers, but also our allies across the world, particularly the UK did a lot of training. Our European allies in the EU did a lot of training, particularly the Eastern European countries in the region, also Canada. We stepped up and we helped to train the next generation of Ukrainian military, and through that, we've helped professionalize, arm, and train Ukraine's military since 2014 to prepare for the exact contingency that now occurred earlier this year, which is a full-scale invasion by Russia. Our efforts are paying off as Russia's invasion has floundered and its military has been truly denigrated. If you need more proof of how successful aid to Ukraine has been over the years, let's look at this map. When the invasion came in February of this year, all of this area in blue was occupied by Russia. Ukraine has now taken back about 55% of its own territory, liberated these areas, and they continue to make progress, as you know, here in Kherson and here in the Kharkiv region and throughout eastern and southeastern and northeastern Ukraine. Russia had thought they had an easy battle on their hands. They thought that within a matter of days or weeks, this entire map would be read, that all of Ukraine would be theirs. Instead, since February, Ukraine has liberated over 74,000 square kilometers of sovereign territory and thousands, millions, in fact, of Ukrainian citizens who have embraced these troops as liberators. Ukraine's fighters have strong morale, but they'll be the first to tell you that none of this would have been possible without help from this body, from the U.S. House, from the United States taxpayers, to give them the tools they needed to protect their freedom. We have sent Ukraine now billions of dollars worth of military, economic, and humanitarian aid since that attack in February. Humanitarian aid that has saved lives, economic aid that helps keep the Ukrainian government and economy afloat, and military aid that has enabled Ukraine's brave defense of their homeland. Javelin missile launchers have helped stop the mechanized advance toward Kyiv back in February and again in March of this year. But since the summer, the most important weapon has been these high-mobility artillery rocket systems, known as HIMARS. We have provided about 20 of these units. Not a single one, by the way, has been taken out by the Russian military. It's extraordinary. They shoot and they scoot, and they are very effective. These same weapons have been provided, by the way, to the Ukrainians by Germany and by the UK, so we're not alone, nor should we be. Our allies should be there for Ukraine. As I've said on this floor many times, these 20 launchers have been game changers in the battlefield. By the way, see, my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, is on the floor today. When we were in Ukraine a few months ago, we were talking to the U.S. Embassy personnel, a small, dedicated group who were there, about what was happening. They said the day before that they had ordered food in Kyiv, and when the food arrived in bags, hamburgers, by the way, on the outside of the bag was written, "Thank you for the HIMARS." Thank you for the HIMARS. We are told that newborns in Ukraine are often taking the name HIMAR now. That's the degree to which they know and appreciate what we have provided for them to be able to save their homeland, their families, and their freedom. It's the long range and high precision of these weapons that has enabled Ukraine to be so successful, particularly going after Russian logistics, command and control, cutting off the troops as they did in Kherson, forcing the Russians to leave that city, the first major city that Russia occupied. It's also critical that we send more air defense equipment, particularly counter-drone weapons, to Ukraine right now. We've got to continue to provide the Ukrainians with these air defense systems, including cost-effective electronic warfare systems that will enable them to control the skies over the long term without exhausting their stockpiles of anti-air missiles. We know what's happening. As Ukraine is making progress on the battlefield, Russia, out of desperation, is turning to civilian attacks, targeted civilian attacks. That's what's happening every day, every night in Ukraine. I was pleased to see recent reports that the administration may soon be sending Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine to defend against Russia's critical bombardment on these civilian targets, particularly on critical energy infrastructure. In my view, this is long overdue. Patriots are defensive. Of course, we should have sent those as soon as we could and trained up the Ukrainians on them, and we could have avoided so much death and destruction. But it's good that the administration is now considering doing it. I would hope that we will hear something positive on that soon. Russia's foreign ministry predictably warned last Thursday that if the United States delivers these air defense systems to Ukraine, it would be, quote, another provocative move by the United States, end quote. They said this would result in a swift response from Moscow. Ladies and gentlemen, this is clear propaganda. Patriot missiles are defensive by their nature. They're not the same kind of missiles you would fire into another country offensively. They are smaller missiles meant to kill missiles in the air and drones in the air and airplanes in the air. Any reasonable person can clearly see that the provocateur here is not the United States or any other country. It is Russia, of course. Ukraine has every right to defend its citizens, and I believe America is well within its rights to help them do that. This is more evidence that Russia's claims of American provocations are baseless. They always have been. Javelins, Stingers, HIMARS, now Patriots, and every time they have said that this is provocative. And they'll continue to claim that anything we give Ukraine to disrupt this genocidal invasion is provocative. So why do we keep letting these illogical claims stifle our aid to Ukraine? Let's not let it happen here with the Patriots. For the past 10 months, I've seen news story after news story about the U.S. refusing to provide this or that weapon to Ukraine for fear of provoking Russia. They've been asking for weapons since the very start that we have yet to provide. Fourth-generation aircraft, F-16s that are in other countries that are willing to provide them, but they need our licenses. We need to approve it for those planes to go. Main battle tanks, they want to make this a conflict where they have a chance, tank to tank, to be able to have Abrams tanks. Long-range missiles like the ATACMS missiles that Ukraine has asked for since the beginning of this conflict would have enabled larger Ukrainian advances than the ones you see on this map. They would be doing even better. The same fear of provoking Russia is exactly what drove the Obama administration back in the day to refuse to provide any lethal assistance at all to Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. That certainly did not stop the Russians from holding on to Crimea and parts of the Donbass. It just emboldened them because they knew that the United States was not going to respond, and therefore our allies, without our leadership, were not going to help. Likewise, refusing to give Ukraine the weapons it needs now will not stop Russia's onslaught. No one can believe that. Russia will only leave Ukrainian territory if it is pushed out by force of arms. It will not suddenly decide to leave if we just give in to their unreasonable demands and agree with them that because it's provocative, we can't provide it. We got to continue to provide more aid to Ukraine and do it as soon as possible. We can't allow a stalemate to set in, or worse, allow Russia to regain the initiative during this critical time. Every day this war drags on, there are more impacts on our economy, on the global economy, and every day this war drags on, there are more war crimes being committed by Russia. Throughout my several trips to the region since the invasion began 10 months ago, I have spoken with women and children who have seen death and destruction that few of us would ever imagine. Our military aid can propel the forces of Ukraine to victory, but the mental and emotional toll of this war will be felt for decades to come. As Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure continued to knock out power around the country, last Wednesday and Thursday, 7 civilians were killed, and a further 19 were wounded, according to a report from President Zelensky's office. Yesterday, only 20% of Kyiv, this modern city in Ukraine, only 20% of it had lights. And the war crimes do not end there. In the recently liberated city of Kherson, Ukrainian officials discovered a room that Russian soldiers had used specifically for the detention and torture of children. According to the Ukrainian Parliament's Commissioner for Human Rights, we saw the rock bottom in Kherson. The children were given little water and almost no food. According to locals, the children were also subjected to psychological abuse. One 14-year-old boy was arrested and tortured just for taking a picture of broken Russian equipment. Who can hear these words and truly think that the Ukrainians or the West are the true provocateurs here? And that's just the war crimes we know about, and we know about a lot of them now. We don't know what horrors are still being conducted here behind the lines in occupied areas of Ukraine. Unfortunately, Russia is making it abundantly clear that it will do nothing to hold its soldiers accountable for these crimes in Ukraine. A new bill making its way in the Russian legislature would effectively legalize any and all war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine if those crimes are, quote, aimed to protect the interest of the Russian Federation. As many of us have said for months, the pain and suffering inflicted on the innocent people of Ukraine is the point And now Russian soldiers will have official legal cover to commit those atrocities. This is a terror campaign, knocking out power, putting people in the dark, in the cold during the Ukrainian winter. We can't allow this suffering to continue. I'll be leaving the Senate soon and ending my time in this great chamber. It's my last speech on the Senate floor about Ukraine, but before I go, a couple of thoughts about the future. Ukraine can win this war. They've shown that. That ending has been clear to many of us for a long time if we provide assistance. Compare Ukraine's military competence, bravery, discipline, and creativity on the one hand. On the other hand, Russia's stunning incompetence and lack of ability to control or even supply its troops. There was a New York Times story over the weekend you may have seen in the Sunday Times about Russia's inability to provide troops with their basic needs. Russia has fumbled every opportunity it has had in this war, from its failed attack on Kyiv at the beginning to the invasion of its poor defenses of Kharkiv Oblast and in the west bank of the Dnipro River. Even their supposed victories in the Donetsk area have come after long, grinding advances that come at the cost of thousands of casualties. At best, these are Pyrrhic victories that reflect a serious inability to think or learn creatively on the part of the Russian forces. Ukraine, on the other hand, has had the moral high ground and the morale and the spirit in this war since the first Russian soldiers crossed the border with Belarus in the north and the lines of contact here in the east. Ukrainian soldiers have either outright defeated Russia's offensive, as they did in the north or in the spring, or slowed them to a crawl, as they have done in the east. Right now, Russian forces near the city of Bakhmut are advancing no more than 100 to 200 meters a day at a cost, we are told, of at least 50 Russian soldiers a day. And on the attack, Ukrainians have been brave, bold, and relentless. Their liberation of the Kharkiv Oblast in September was a matter of carefully testing Russia's defenses there. Once a weakness was spotted, Ukrainian soldiers surged through a hole in the line. 1 week later, all the province was liberated. It was a beautifully executed operation which will likely be studied in military academies for a long time to come. And it was American and European and Canadian training that allowed that to happen. In the south near Kherson, it was a very different kind of offensive. There, Ukrainian forces, provided with these HIMARS from the United States we talked about earlier, gradually whittled away at Russian forces to the point where the situation became untenable. They couldn't be resupplied, and so they left, again, the one major city that they had occupied. One of the counteroffensive in Kharkiv required quick thinking and an ability to rapidly exploit success. The other in Kherson required meticulous planning and patience. Two very different operations, yet Ukrainian soldiers pulled them both off. That is why Ukraine can win this war. Its defenders are bold, creative, smart, and endlessly brave. They've proven it to us. Every Russian missile fired at the Ukrainian infrastructure to destroy the Ukrainian people's will is a wasted missile. Why do I say that? Because the intention is to make the Ukrainian people want to back off, to lose their resolve and this morale and the spirit I talked about. It had just the opposite effect every time it happens, which is that it makes the Ukrainian people even more resolved and even more intent to win this war. The Ukrainian people are unbreakable, as we've seen. And once Ukraine wins this war, I believe it will join the European Union, and eventually it will join NATO. The EU granted candidate status to Ukraine in June, which sent them down the path toward eventual membership. That was a good sign. Since then, according to the chairman of Ukraine's parliament, Ukraine has already passed 7 pieces of legislation to adopt reforms that are necessary to join the European Union. According to the Deputy Prime Minister, Ukraine expects to be a full-fledged member of the EU within 5 years. That's the future. Regarding NATO, by the way, I have long supported Ukraine's intention to join this alliance, the most successful military alliance, of course, in the history of the world. None of this would be happening were they in NATO already. And it's in line with NATO's longstanding open-door policy. The alliance has always welcomed the applications of any and all eligible countries, and once Ukraine pushes Russia out of all of its sovereign territory, I believe it can take this step. It certainly would provide incredible military power to NATO. Russia launched its initial invasion in 2014 and its larger one in 2022 precisely to keep Ukraine out of NATO. But all sovereign countries, including Ukraine, have the right to decide their own path, their own destiny, their own alliances, their own foreign policy. We cannot legitimize the Kremlin's ridiculous demands by giving up now. Plus, it's hard to think of a more qualified country to join NATO than Ukraine. Russia has been the greatest threat to the alliance for at least a decade. What better country to induct into NATO than one that has extensive experience defeating that threat on the battlefield? So it's in our interest, but not just in our strategic interest to aid Ukraine, it's also in our moral interest. If we falter in support of Ukraine, we condemn millions of innocent Ukrainians to a future of repression, a future of summary executions like we saw in Bucha and Izum. I've been there. I've seen the damage they did. I've seen the place where they had a mass grave burying Ukrainian citizens. A future of torture chambers built for adults and children alike, a future in which the very idea of being proudly Ukrainian is outlawed and punishable by torture or death. If we falter, we allow President Putin to continue to threaten the rest of Europe and potentially start a war with NATO that will draw on the United States. We cannot do that. This aggression must stop here. Ukraine and its Western allies are fighting to preserve freedom in Europe and globally. How this war ends will have far-reaching consequences, both on the rest of the continent and around the world. We can stop Russian aggression here, then we can deter other adversaries. They're watching. China's watching. Iran is watching. They're watching and thinking about whether they should start similarly horrific wars of conquest. We must send a message to the rest of the world that America will not back down when rogue nations threaten free countries. This has always been America's role. Today I was in the National Mall seeing the prayer that Franklin Roosevelt said on D-Day. And this plaque has just been placed on the National Mall based on legislation we passed here in this body. And in that prayer, Franklin Roosevelt says that American troops were not going to Europe for conquest. It was not for the love of conquest. It was not for the lust of conquest. Rather, it was to combat the Germans and to stop conquest that American troops were there to liberate. That's what we do. In this case, it's not our troops. They aren't asking for our troops, but they are asking for the tools to be able to be successful in liberating the people of Ukraine. So I urge my colleagues to support the funding bill that was released yesterday that includes $47 billion in assistance for Ukraine. We talked about this before, but it will support the military, the civilians, and the government in Ukraine as that country continues to fight off the invasion. I know these are significant investments, and we must be good stewards of taxpayer money, and I'm very supportive of the accountability measures that are in that legislation that are very important, the end-use monitoring for our military equipment, the fact that an American accounting firm, Deloitte, is there to ensure that the money is properly spent, that the World Bank gives us regular reports and audits the funding. This is significant. And Ukraine, by the way, is for this transparency, and we should be too. But as we're good stewards of American taxpayer money, let's also remember that Ukraine is fighting for all of us. Ukraine is fighting for all of us and fighting for freedom. And freedom is a worthy investment. I yield back my time.